A warm Saturday afternoon in Willow Creek promised sunny skies and carefree laughter, but one phone call threatened to shatter that idyll. 11-year-old Danielle Hamilton, dressed in bright yellow sneakers, was just waiting for her friend outside a small ice cream shop. No one could have predicted that one unwarranted accusatory gesture would unleash a storm of outrage and reveal an unexpected connection to the highest echelons of law enforcement. The conversation that ensued that day shook the entire neighborhood. A put a family on serious trial and left one woman speechless in the face of justice. Willow Creek was a typical suburb where everyone knew each other, at least by word of mouth. Residents prided themselves on their openness and friendliness, but bias and double standards often lurked beneath that layer of politeness. The streets had neat houses with white picket fences and manicured lawns, and cozy cafes and corner stores. One popular spot was the Sweet Scoops ice cream store, where families with children flocked on Saturday afternoons. That afternoon, around 3 in the afternoon, the kids' soccer league team had finished another game, and parents went with their children to celebrate the victory. Danielle was not part of the event. She spent the morning at the library, deep into another detective story from the Nancy Drew series. The girl dreamed of becoming an investigator or even an FBI agent like her mom. Danny, as her friends called her, had arranged to meet her friend Tess for ice cream. Tess was already in line inside, and Danny herself leaned against the pink wall of the bench, tapping her foot on the sidewalk to the beat of the tune playing on her headphones. She pulled out her phone, checking messages from her mom, Agent Mara Hamilton, who, according to Aunt Clarice, was on a business trip to Quantico. The quiet day might have stayed that way had it not been for the appearance of a woman named Michelle Sanders. A tall blonde woman in an elegant blouse and tight pants emerged from the coffee shop holding a latte and a phone. Her gaze slid down the street and stopped on Danny. The corners of her lips flickered with slight displeasure, and her fingers clenched the glass tighter. A few seconds later, the woman made a call. Danny noticed the look in her eyes, but didn't pay it any mind. Perhaps the woman recognized her. That was what sometimes happened when someone heard about her mother. The look on Michelle's face, however, didn't speak of curiosity or friendliness. Her eyes read something else entirely, suspicion. The woman stepped closer, and Danny, raised to respect her elders, smiled politely. But Michelle did not reciprocate. "Excuse me, young lady." Her voice was cold and aloof. "What are you doing here?" Danny looked around, confused. Maybe the question wasn't for her, but there was no one around. "I'm waiting for a friend," the girl replied, holding back her surprise. Michelle narrowed her eyes. "Waiting for a friend?" There was sarcasm in her voice. "And why did I see you looking around at the parked cars?" Danny froze. "I wasn't looking at the cars," she said quietly. "I was just standing here." "Really?" Michelle tilted her head. "I thought you were looking to see if the doors were locked." "Don't try to deny it." The girl's chest tightened at the unexpected accusation. No one had ever accused her of such a thing before. She wanted to call Aunt Clarice or her mother Haoas, but confusion restrained her. "I didn't do anything wrong." Danny finally squeezed out. Sure. Michelle nodded, pulling out her phone. "But I'm not going to tolerate suspicious behavior in my town." Danny noticed the familiar 3 digits on the phone's screen, 911. "Hello? Yes, police? I want to report a suspicious person," the woman said firmly, keeping her eyes on the girl. "Yes, I'm on Maple Street. in front of the ice cream store. It's about a young, dark-skinned girl, about 12 years old. She's acting weird, looking at cars. I think she's trying to steal something. Danny's heart raced. She couldn't believe this was really happening. She was just waiting for her friend, dreaming of strawberry ice cream, and now someone was accusing her of a crime. Tears came to her eyes, but she didn't let them spill. She knew. Her mom had taught her never to show weakness in situations like this. Michelle took a few steps away as she continued talking to the dispatcher, calling out the girl's description and demanding that officers come immediately. Danny suddenly realized that all eyes of those around her were fixed on her. Someone walked by, casting a wary glance. Someone hesitated, but said nothing. No one intervened. And within minutes, police sirens were already blaring outside. Danny closed her eyes and took a deep breath. All she had to do was wait. But no one, including Michelle herself, could predict who would show up on the scene first. At that moment, Tess walked out of Sweet Treats, holding 2 ice cream cones. She immediately noticed that Danny looked pale and shivering, and there was a strange woman standing next to her, talking animatedly on the phone. Tess slowly walked over and handed her friend her horn. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Danny swallowed with difficulty. "She called the police on me." Her voice shook. "Why?" Tess stared in surprise at the stranger, who was now pacing the sidewalk, continuing her conversation. "Yeah." "I don't know," Danny whispered, holding back tears. "She said I looked suspicious, like I was checking out cars." Tess frowned, not sure what was going on. She looked around, hoping to see one of the adults who might be able to help. But Mr. Guzman and the owner of the cafe was busy, and passers-by either didn't notice what was happening or didn't dare to intervene. Meanwhile, the woman ended the call and looked at the girls with a satisfied smile. "The police are on their way." "You'd better not move," she said in a commanding tone. Tess clenched her fists, literally shaking with indignation, but Danny, still gripped by fear, shook her head slightly, urging her not to escalate the situation. Their ice cream was beginning to melt in the hot sun, but their appetite was already gone. Danny frantically grabbed her phone and, without thinking, dialed her mother's number. She hoped that her mother, Baz, even though she was in another city, would answer. Tones ones, too. Voicemail. "That's how it is," the woman grinned, obviously pleased with the girl's failure. "Call whoever you want, you little thief. The police will deal with you." Danny's eyes watered. She tried her best to hold it together, but inside her she was seething with humiliation and fear. What if the cops believed this woman? She'd heard stories of wrongful convictions so many times. What if she became one of them? Just then, sirens wailed in the distance. The woman raised her head triumphantly, as if she was already anticipating the girl's punishment. A police car with flashing lights pulled up to the sidewalk, and Officer Barry Wilson stepped out of it, a stocky man with a kindly look, clearly accustomed to resolving conflicts peacefully. He surveyed the situation, noticed the tension, and decided to deal with it before jumping to conclusions. "Good afternoon, ladies. May I have a word with you?" He turned to Danny and Tess. Danny barely audibly swallowed. Yes, sir, she said, her voice trembling. Tess squeezed her hand harder. "That's her," the woman said loudly, pointing at Danny. "I saw her looking into the cars, checking to see if they were locked. She was obviously going to steal something," Officer Wilson frowned and turned to the girl. Is that true? Did you look inside the cars? No, sir. Danny shook her head, her eyes full of tears. I was just waiting for a friend. I didn't touch anyone's car. Honest? She's telling the truth, Tess intervened. She was parked here the whole time. The officer looked carefully at the girls, then at the woman, her eyes blazing with confidence. He sighed and pulled out a notepad. Can I get in touch with one of your relatives? He asked Danny softly. Yes, my Aunt Clarice is home right now, the girl whispered as she entered the number on the phone with trembling fingers. Officer Wilson took the number and stepped back to make the call. At that time, a second police car arrived on the scene and his partner, Officer Linda Markham, stepped out of it. Experienced and respected in the precinct, she immediately sensed the tension in the air. As she stepped closer, she glanced around at the scowling woman, the two frightened girls, and Officer Wilson talking on the phone. Experience told her that this situation could have been far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Officer Markham looked at the woman intently, raising an eyebrow slightly. Is everything all right? She asked with a note of doubt in her voice. Michelle immediately took the opportunity to give her side of the story. I called the police because that girl was trying to break into cars, she said indignantly. Willow Creek has enough theft problems as it is. We can't let this sort of thing walk the streets with impunity. Markham shifted her gaze to Danny, whose shoulders were tense with fear, and to Tess, who stood firmly beside her friend, as if protecting her. There was a tautness in the woman's words. Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Wilson had returned, still holding the phone in his hand. Ma'am. He turned to Michelle. I spoke to the girl's aunt. She's on her way. We'll be here in 10 minutes to clear the air. Then he turned to Danny. Your aunt asked that you wait for her here. Is that okay with you? Danny nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She hoped Clarice would come as soon as possible and get her out of this nightmare. But Michelle wouldn't be deterred. You're just going to let her go, she shrieked. She should be arrested or at least brought to the station for questioning. She was up to something. I know it for a fact. Officer Markham gave her a look of weary patience. Ma'am, with respect, but we don't have any proof of her guilt. No cars were damaged, nothing was stolen. Without witnesses or evidence, we have no reason to detain the child. Michelle's face turned red with anger. She's lying, pointing her finger at Danny again. She exclaimed. I saw everything with my own eyes. Suddenly, the door of Sweet Scoops opened and Mr. Guzman, the owner of the place, came out. He was a good-natured, middle-aged man with a friendly smile and a noticeable limp. Rumor had it that he had hurt his leg playing soccer in high school. Now his usually warm expression was replaced by seriousness. Officers, I'm sorry to intrude, but this girl is a frequent visitor, he said, pointing to Danny. She never causes any trouble. I even have a security camera that looks right down the street. You can check it out if you want. Michelle froze. She didn't realize her actions might have been recorded. Officer Markham didn't let the moment pass. That might help, she said. Can I see the tape? Sure, come on in. Mr. Guzman nodded. Markham went inside and Wilson stayed outside, monitoring the situation. The atmosphere remained tense. Danny stood, barely breathing, and Tess squeezed her hand for support. Meanwhile, Michelle shuffled from foot to foot, her self-confidence shaken. In the cafe, Officer Markham leaned over the monitor. The recording was clear. From the moment Danny appeared on the street until Michelle called the police d'accusation, the girl hadn't moved from her spot. She just stood there, waiting for her friend. Didn't touch the cars, didn't look in the windows, didn't do anything suspicious. Markham sighed. It was all becoming clear. She stepped back out onto the street and met Wilson's gaze. A barely perceptible movement of the head, and he understood. "What did the camera show?" Michelle asked defiantly. "The footage showed the girl standing outside the cafe," said Markham calmly. "She didn't touch the cars. She didn't do anything suspicious. It was just as she told it." Michelle was confused for a second, then tried to object. Maybe the camera just didn't capture the moment. Maybe she'd done this before. Wilson sighed tiredly. "Ma'am, we have no evidence to back up what you're saying. Like I said, it's just a misunderstanding." Meanwhile, a small crowd had gathered around. People began to whisper, looking at Michelle with judgment. Her face turned red. Her gaze flickered, but there was no way out. At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the sidewalk. The car parked smoothly behind the police car, and Aunt Clarice jumped out of it. Her face was tense with excitement. "Honey, are you okay?" She ran up to Danny and hugged her tightly. "You haven't been touched. Are you okay?" Danny, barely holding back tears, nodded. "It's okay, Aunt Clarice. It's just scary." Officer Wilson stepped forward, introduced himself, and explained the situation. Clarice listened, but her gaze traveled down the street until it stopped on Michelle. "So you're the one who called the police on my niece?" Her voice was calm, but there was metal in it. Michelle faltered, but then regained her confidence. "I was just trying to protect our neighborhood. She was acting suspicious." Clarice folded her arms across her chest. "Suspicious? A little girl waiting for a friend with ice cream? And you, without any evidence, decided she was a criminal?" Michelle opened her mouth, but Clarice interrupted her. "Do you have children, miss?" Michelle remained silent. The crowd was watching what was happening. Some whispered, some shook their heads. There was silence, interrupted only by the distant sounds of street traffic. Officer Wilson looked at Clarice. "Mom, now that the situation is resolved, you can take your niece home." Clarice nodded gratefully, but kept her eyes on Michelle, whose anger was now mixed with shame. It was clear around her that she had no excuses left. Clarice looked softly but firmly at the police officers. "This day has been a real test for my niece. We'd better go home." Wilson nodded. "Of course, ma'am. We just need to finalize the report, and then she is free to go." Michelle, realizing that she was losing ground, tried to make one last lunge. "This is just outrageous. She was definitely up to something. If you're not going to arrest her, at least let her get out of here before she does something else." Clarice, maintaining her dignity, turned to Michelle. "We'll leave. But remember, baseless accusations can have serious consequences." Michelle crossed her arms and stood stubbornly, unwilling to admit her mistake. "I'm just concerned about the safety of our neighborhood." Officer Markham took her aside, trying to reason with her. Meanwhile, Danny, Tess, and Clarice headed for the car. Officer Wilson caught up with them to finalize the last details. He looked at Danny gently. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. I hope you don't lose confidence in our work." Danny nodded, still shaking, but grateful for the kind words. She climbed into the car and Tess squeezed her hand for support. Clarice finished talking to the policeman, got behind the wheel, and drove the car away. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She glanced in the rearview mirror meeting Danny's gaze. "I'm so sorry, honey. I'm sorry you had to go through that," Danny sobbed. "It's not your fault, Auntie. It's just 0.0. I've never faced anything like this before." She looked at me like I was a criminal. Like I was. Clarice's eyes glittered with restrained anger. Some people let their prejudices rule them. But sometimes fate puts things in their proper place. They didn't know how soon their words would become prophetic, and that Marcia Hamilton, Danny's mother, was closer than they could have imagined. That night, Danny was unable to sleep for a long time at Aunt Clarice's house. Memories of the day's events swirled in her head. She felt drained, but anxiety kept her awake. Tears flowed down her cheeks, dripping onto her pillow. The world that had always seemed safe thanks to the love of her mother, aunt, and friends suddenly showed its cruel face. On the first floor, Clarice was making calls. She tried to reach Marcia Biars, but her sister's cell phone wasn't answering. It wasn't surprising. Marcia Hamilton was the head of one of the FBI's divisions, and sometimes she'd be gone for an hour or even days, if the job required it. But Clarice knew her sister wouldn't just let it go. Earlier, she had relayed a message that she would try to get home early. At 9 p.m, Clarice's phone rang. Her sister's name popped up on the screen. "Marcia! Oh, thank God, I've been trying to call you." On the other end of the line, Marcia's voice was calm, but she sounded worried. "I saw your messages." What happened? Clarice recounted in detail the events of the day. Michelle Saunders' unfounded accusations, the call to the police, the lack of evidence, Danny's fear and shock. Marcia listened in silence, but Clarice could feel the tension building in her voice. When Clarice finished, Marcia replied firmly, "I'm on the first flight out. My business in Quantico is coming to an end. Tell Danny I love her, and I'll be home soon." "She needs you, Marcia," Clarice said quietly. "She's hanging in there, but she's hurting." "I'll fix it," Marcia promised. After the calls, Clarice felt relieved. She went upstairs and looked into Danny's room. The girl was lying curled up, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Clarice sat down beside her and hugged her niece gently. "Mommy will be here in the morning, honey," she whispered. "Everything's going to be okay." Danny clung to her, trying to hold back more tears. "I just want to forget this day. I feel so ashamed, even though I didn't do anything." Clarice stroked her hair. "I know. But we're not going to let it break us." Danny nodded silently. Her tears slowly dried as she fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, just as dawn was breaking, a gray sedan pulled up to Clarice's house. Marcia Hamilton stepped out of the car in an austere navy blue suit, her posture impeccable, but her eyes burning with cold fury. She walked into the house, set her bag down at the front door, and walked into the kitchen, where Clarice was already making coffee. The sisters embraced. "She's still asleep," Clarice whispered. It had been a rough night. Marcia nodded, her face calm, but her fists clenched. "I'll go up to her." She quietly opened the door of Danny's room. The girl moved, opened her eyes. When she saw her mother, she immediately sat up in bed, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "Mom!" Danny sobbed, rushing into her arms. Marcia hugged her daughter tightly. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry, baby." It wasn't fair. Danny snuggled into her shoulder. She looked at me like I was a criminal. Marcia pulled away, looked into her daughter's eyes. The woman was wrong, and it wasn't your fault. Don't you dare question that. She ran her hand through her daughter's hair. But I promise you, we're not going to let this go. Danny blinked. What do you mean? Marcia took a deep breath. She'd faced many injustices in her FBI career. But this was about her daughter, and she wasn't going to let it slide. I mean, we're going to get consequences for this woman. She needs to realize that her actions will not go unpunished. But the police have already said there was no crime, Danny muttered. Marcia nodded. That's right. But she made a false call, and that's a different conversation. Danny hesitated, but then nodded. Okay. Marcia smiled, proud of her determination. Then the first thing we'll do is get the police report, and then I'll talk to this woman personally. She's obviously not expecting to see me. Marcia smiled, but there was determination in her eyes. I can't say for sure, but if she has any conscience, she'll realize what she did was wrong. Later that morning, Marcia went with Danny to the Willow Creek police station. It was a modest brick building with large windows surrounded by a manicured lawn. Inside, the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and printer ink. Approaching the front desk, Marcia introduced herself, good morning. I'm Marcia Hamilton, and this is my daughter, Danielle. We're here to review the report of yesterday's incident on Maple Street. The duty sergeant, a middle-aged man named Keys, recognized her instantly. Agent Hamilton, he nodded respectfully. News traveled fast in the small town, and many law enforcement officers knew of her position with the FBI, though she rarely used her influence in day-to-day matters. Sure, we'll get it all set up now. Officers Wilson and Markham led the call from yesterday. A few minutes later, they were led into a small meeting room, where Officer Markham soon entered. She smiled warmly at Danny. It's good to see that you're okay. Then, adopting a professional tone, she nodded to Marcia. Agent Hamilton, we have the report. It's standard protocol. No charges were filed because there was no crime. Marcia calmly took the documents. I see. And did Ms. Michelle Sanders leave any official statement? Markham opened the folder and flipped through the papers. She only verbally reported that she saw Danielle looking into the cars. We had no proof of what she said, so we closed the case. After we talked, she just walked away. Marcia scrutinized the report. I see that no complaint was filed against her for false summons. Markham shook her head. We usually treat it as a concerned citizen's appeal if the caller genuinely believes they witnessed suspicious behavior. Without evidence of intentional deception, filing a false call charge is difficult. Marcia thoughtfully folded her fingers into a lock. I understand, but this incident was humiliating and painful for my daughter. The security cameras clearly show that she was just standing still. I'd like to speak to Ms. Sanders personally. Markham and the duty sergeant looked at each other. Through the glass window, they could see the other officers talking amongst themselves. We can't just give you her address, but we can offer mediation. If Ms. Sanders agrees, the meeting will take place here, with an officer present. If she refuses, you can file a formal complaint. Marcia evaluated her options. A formal complaint could take weeks, but mediation could show whether the woman was remorseful for her actions. If my daughter agrees, we'll go to mediation. If Ms. Sanders refuses, I'll file a complaint. The security footage clearly shows that her summons had no basis. Danny shifted uneasily from foot to foot, but her voice sounded firm. I'm afraid to see her, but I want her to realize how much she's hurt me. Marcia looked proudly at her daughter and nodded. Then so be it. Markham sighed and said quietly, I'll do my best to arrange a meeting. It may take a day or two. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Danielle, I'm sorry this happened to you. Danny smiled weakly. Thank you. As they walked out of the lot, a light breeze swayed the tree crowns. Are you okay? Marcia asked, noticing her daughter's thoughtfulness. Danny shrugged her shoulders. I just want to be a normal kid again. I wish none of this would happen. Marcia put her arm around her shoulders. You are a normal kid. It's not your fault. Sometimes people are hindered by their prejudices, but we don't have to be silent. Danny huddled against her mother, feeling safe for the first time in a long time. She didn't want to face Michelle again, but she knew she had to do it to move on. Meanwhile, news in Willow Creek was spreading fast. Many people knew that the woman who had called the police was now in the spotlight herself, and that the mother of the injured girl was not just anyone, but an FBI agent. This information reached Ms. Sanders as well. I don't understand what the problem is, she said indignantly to a friend on the phone. All I was doing was keeping the neighborhood safe. I'm not going to apologize. Her friend, Karen, cautiously remarked, but are you sure you want to ignore it? I heard that this girl's mother is in a pretty high position. Are you sure there won't be repercussions? Michelle snorted. I didn't do anything. If I get pressured, I'll say I had the right to call. It's my civic duty. But despite her bravado, she felt uneasy. She didn't like conflict, especially with people who knew the law better than she did. She was afraid it would take a serious turn. Under pressure, she still agreed to the meeting, but reluctantly. At this time at Clarissa's house, Marcia and Danny were taking a leisurely stroll in the backyard. The night air was fresh, the grass smelling like it had been recently mowed. How do these meetings go? Danny asked, hugging herself against the cool breeze. Marcia sighed. It's a civil conversation in the presence of an officer. Each side presents their point of view, and the police officer tries to help find a solution. It's not a court of law, well, no one is forcing anyone to apologize. But sometimes these meetings help avoid lengthy proceedings. Danny nodded. Do you think she'll apologize? Marcia pressed her lips together. I don't know. But we'll know soon enough. The next day, the police station confirmed that a mediation meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 4 p.m. Danielle was nervous, but found comfort in knowing that her mother, strong, confident, and ready to protect her, would be there for her. Wednesday's weather seemed to reflect Danny's inner state. Low gray clouds and drizzling rain created a sense of tension. As Marcia drove the car to the station, Danny clutched her hand tightly, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the police station, they were escorted into a small meeting room with white walls, bright fluorescent lighting, and a round wooden table. Officer Markham was already waiting for them, smiling demurely. She had papers in front of her and a laptop ready to take notes. A moment later, Michelle Sanders entered the room. Her hair was neatly gathered into a bun, her posture tense. A beige trench coat over a stylish blouse and skirt made her look like a confident woman, but her gaze betrayed nervousness. She glanced quickly around the room, lingering on Danny with slight irritation, then shifted her gaze to Marcia. Tension hung in the air. Marcia stood up and calmly extended her hand. "Mrs. Sanders, I'm Marcia Hamilton, Danielle's mother." Michelle hesitated for a second, then discreetly shook her hand. "Michelle," she introduced herself briefly. Officer Markham cleared her throat, urging everyone to take their seats. "Thank you for coming. This meeting is needed to discuss the incident on Maple Street and Mrs. Sanders' call to the police." Michelle folded her hands on the table and immediately began. "I believe I did the right thing. I saw suspicious behavior and reported it." Marcia kept a nonchalant expression on her face. "I understand that you feel that way. However, the security footage says otherwise. Danielle was just standing outside the ice cream store." Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe the cameras didn't capture everything. I know what I saw. A girl in a brightly colored jacket moving between cars." Danny perked up. "I didn't have a jacket. Just a t-shirt. And I didn't move away from the bench at all." Michelle averted her eyes. "Danny, I was just concerned about the safety of our neighborhood. We've had a few break-ins lately." Marcia tilted her head. "Have there been any arrests? Are there any suspects that look like my daughter?" Michelle hesitated. I don't know. I just did what I thought was right." Officer Markham calmly interjected. "Mrs. Sanders/Danielle is very distressed about what happened. She's just an 11-year-old kid. Is there anything else you might want to tell her?" Michelle cast a quick glance at the girl, then looked away again. "I'm sorry if she was scared. That wasn't my intent. But I was doing my civic duty. This is the first time Marcia has let her emotions get the better of her. Your duty was to accuse my child baselessly and call the police? Did you consider how that might have turned out for her if the police had taken your call differently? If they would have used force?" Michelle tensed, her face reddening. "Are you saying I'm a racist?" Marcia looked at her intently. "I'm asking you to consider, did my daughter's race influence your hasty assessment of the situation? Because if it had been a white girl, I'm sure you wouldn't have called the police so quickly." Officer Markham, sensing the tension building, said cautiously, "We are here to discuss the situation and find understanding." Michelle turned away. "I'm not a racist. I have the right to call the police if I see anything suspicious." Marcia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "No one is taking that right away from you. But before you dial 911, make sure your suspicions are reasonable. Because this time, it was my daughter who was hurt. Next time, it could be someone else. You have to realize the consequences of your actions." There was silence. Danny stared at the woman, hoping to hear a real apology. But there was none. Marcia stood up. "If that's it, we'll go. We've done what we can." Officer Markham nodded. "I think we've reached the point where further dialogue is useless." Michelle sat silent/clearly stunned. Only when Marcia and Danny headed for the exit did she mutter, "I really didn't mean to hurt anyone." Marcia stopped and, by turning around, said calmly, "Then next time think twice before jumping to conclusions." Danny took her mother's hand, and they walked out of the station. Outside, the rain had already subsided. The girl breathed in the cool air, feeling the tension slowly fade away. She hadn't gotten the apology she had hoped for, but something was more important. She hadn't let fear break her. Most importantly, she knew her mom would always be there to protect her. Markham cleared her throat again, recognizing the rising tension in the room. If we cannot come to a more conciliatory solution, the Hamilton family has the right to file a complaint or go to court, she said. The purpose of this meeting is to avoid further escalation. Mrs. Saunders, do you have more sincere words for an apology? Michelle suddenly felt cornered. Her contrived confidence evaporated and her fingers nervously fumbled with the hem of her skirt. Yatochka. Apologize, she mumbled, trying to sound convincing. For real. Danielle, I'm sorry I caused you trouble. Maybe I did overreact. Daniel looked at her silently, feeling angry, relieved, and even a little sorry at the same time. Thank you, she said quietly, though the belated apology didn't seem sincere. Marcia scrutinized Michelle's expression. The apology sounded forced rather than sincere, but it was a step forward. Thank you, Mrs. Saunders, Carol, she replied in an even tone. I hope you'll be more considerate in the future. Michelle nodded, still avoiding eye contact. Markham, feeling relieved, cleared her throat again. Good. If there is nothing else to add, I consider our meeting complete. She cast a grateful glance at Marcia, as if silently thanking her for not escalating the conflict. Marcia nodded briefly. We consider the matter closed, provided there are no more incidents like this. With those words, she rose from her chair and, with a gentle hug to her daughter, headed for the exit. Danielle sighed, relieved. Her shoulders seemed to feel a little lighter for the first time in days. And Michelle remained seated at the table, still confused. Her fingers trembled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She realized that in this office sat not just a concerned mother, but a high-ranking FBI official. A wave of fear swept through her body. How was it that her simple complaint had turned into such a nightmare? If Michelle thought that was the end of it, she was sorely mistaken. News of her encounter with the FBI agent quickly spread throughout Willow Creek. People who had already heard about the incident now learned the details. She was called to a mediation where she had to apologize. She was met with disapproving looks at Manny's Brew Cafe, and she was squinted at the grocery store. Some neighbors simply avoided her, while others openly condemned her. The Willow Creek Observer, a local newspaper, ran a short story, headlined, "Concerned Resident Calls Police on False Accusation, Forced to Apologize." Although her name wasn't mentioned in the article, it wasn't hard to guess who it was about. One day, while picking out avocados at Parker's grocery, Michelle heard two women whispering nearby. That's the same woman. The one who called the police on the girl. Can you believe it? How could you make such a mistake? Michelle immediately felt her cheeks flush. She tossed the avocado into the basket and hurried to the register. But even there, she was met with a leering look from the teenage cashier. Soon, as she hurriedly crossed the road, almost getting hit by a car, a voice came from the car window. "Michelle, get in." It was Karen. The same friend who had warned her to be careful back then. Michelle didn't hesitate to get into the car. "Your reputation is crumbling before your eyes," Karen said quietly. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Michelle stared out the window. "It's not fair. I made one mistake. It could have happened to anyone." Karen sighed heavily. "You called the police on an innocent child, nice Michelle. She's only 11 years old. Her mother is an FBI agent. You're just glad you didn't get sued." Michelle remained silent. She felt cornered, like her world was falling apart because of one rash mistake. Several weeks passed. Daniel gradually returned to her normal life, going out with her friend Tess, preparing for the school recitation contest. Marcia took up work again, now working from home more often to be near her daughter. Michelle, on the other hand, tried to keep a low profile. She avoided social gatherings, ordered groceries online, and barely left the house. One morning, however, she found a letter in her mailbox from her homeowners association. The letter informed her that she had received a complaint about her inappropriate behavior toward a neighbor's child. Although the Hamilton family did not file a formal complaint, some neighbors did it for them. The association cited serious violations of good neighbor standards and required her attendance at the next board meeting. If her actions were found to be in violation, she could face fines or even other sanctions. That same day, she was summoned to the Human Resources Department at work. She worked for Willow & Company, a marketing agency that prided itself on its inclusivity policy. Her boss, Andrew Carlson, and the head of HR, Lisa Wong, were waiting for her in the meeting room. "Michelle," Andrew began, nervously stroking his tie, "disturbing reports have reached us. They say that you are at the center of a scandal, and it may have a negative impact on the company's image." Lisa nodded. "We take any accusations of discrimination very seriously, especially when it goes against our corporate values. We'd like to hear your version of events." Panic squeezed Michelle's chest. She tried to squeeze out a calm voice. "It was a misunderstanding with a girl from my neighborhood." Michelle lowered her eyes. Her fingers nervously intertwined in her lock. "Yeah. Apologize," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "Honestly, for everything, period, I meant no harm, but I was wrong." Then he stared at her face, feeling conflicted. She was filled with anger, relief, and even a twinge of pity. This apology sounded more sincere than the previous one. She nodded. "Thank you," she replied quietly. Marcia scrutinized Michelle's facial expression. Although her apology wasn't perfect, it was an important step. "I hope you'll be more careful in the future," she said in an even voice. Officer Markham breathed a sigh of relief. "Good. Unless the parties have any objections, we can consider this matter closed." Marcia nodded slightly. "Until new problems arise." With those words, she stood up, took Danny's hand, and they left the room. Michelle remained seated, stunned. She was overwhelmed by the realization of how far-reaching the consequences of her action had been. One call, made based on a preconceived judgment, had nearly ruined her life. On the streets of Willow Creek, word spread quickly. Many residents already knew about the incident, but now they learned that Danny's mother was an FBI agent. The story instantly became a topic of discussion in local circles. In cafes, stores, and on the streets, details of what had happened were whispered. Soon Michelle felt the repercussions. She was leered at in the supermarket, neighbors avoided her gaze, and some openly criticized her actions. One day, as she was picking avocados at the store, Michelle heard a whisper behind her. "That's her, the same woman who called the police on the girl." Her cheeks flared with shame. She dropped the avocado and hurried to the register, where the teenage cashier looked at her with undisguised disapproval. Michelle mumbled a brief greeting and lowered her head. In the parking lot, she almost got hit by a car as she hurriedly crossed the road. Her friend Karen was driving. "Get in," Karen suggested dryly as she opened the passenger door. As soon as Michelle sat down, Karen looked at her reproachfully. "I warned you, didn't I? Now your reputation is ruined." "It's not fair," Michelle flared up. "I only made one phone call. Anyone could have done the same thing." Karen shook her head. "You called the police on an innocent child. She's only 11 years old. And her mother is an FBI agent. Do you realize how lucky you are that they didn't sue you?" Michelle withdrew into herself, staring out the window. She felt trapped in a trap she had created herself. After a few weeks, life in Willow Creek slowly returned to normal. Danny started going out with Tess again, spending time in the library, participating in school activities. Her mom worked from home more and more often, making sure her daughter recovered from her experiences. Meanwhile, Michelle tried to lead a reclusive lifestyle. She ordered groceries online and avoided social events. One morning, however, she received a letter from the Homeowners Association. It said her behavior toward the neighbor's daughter had caused complaints. She was called to a meeting where she had to explain herself. If found guilty, she could face fines or other sanctions. But the trouble didn't end there. Soon she was summoned to speak to the Human Resources Department of the company where she worked. Waiting for her in the conference room were her boss, Andrew Carlson, and head of HR, Lisa Wang. "Michelle Anfers, we've received some disturbing information." Andrew began, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "Word has reached us about the recent incident, and we are concerned about the company's reputation." Lisa folded her hands on the table. "We take discrimination issues very seriously. We need to hear your side of the story." Michelle panicked, but tried to stay calm. "It was a misunderstanding. I thought the girl was trying to break into cars." "Did the issue of racial bias come up here?" Lisa asked bluntly. Michelle swallowed. "No, of course not. Andrew raised his hand, interrupting her. "We're not going to discuss your personal beliefs. But if this case goes public, it's a blow to our brand. We can't afford an employee whose behavior is perceived as racially biased." Michelle felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. One call to the police threatened to ruin her career. Lisa handed her a booklet. "You must take a course on diversity and tolerance. It's a prerequisite for continued employment. In addition, we advise you to take steps to reconcile with the community. We will monitor the situation closely." Michelle nodded, struggling to suppress her tears. "Good. I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Andrew said. "Let's try to put this behind us." After the meeting, Michelle felt crushed. She realized that the consequences of her action would not disappear overnight. She had to prove her sincerity not only with words, but also with deeds. When a forum on cultural understanding was organized in the city Hariu, Michelle decided to participate. On the day of the event, Danny and Marcia also came to see how the community was dealing with the aftermath of the incident. To their surprise, they saw Michelle at the entrance handing out brochures. Upon noticing them, she froze, but then still found the strength to speak. "Agent Hamilton, here, Daniel." "Yeah, Tochka. I want to make a difference. I want to learn and maybe make amends." Danny looked at her carefully. For the first time, there was no arrogance in Michelle's eyes, only genuine remorse. Marcia nodded slightly. It's good that you're here. I hope you'll draw the right conclusions from this. Michelle nodded, her voice trembling. I'll try. From that day on, Willow Creek began to change. People became more considerate of prejudice, began to talk more about tolerance. And Danny realized that one event, no matter how painful, could be the beginning of something bigger. Mara imagined helping other children who faced injustice, how the law protected them instead of punishing them. The thought was exhilarating and empowering. She turned to her mother, her voice sounding confident and determined. Mom, if I ever become an FBI agent, I will make sure that no child has to go through what I went through. Daniela smiled proudly and hugged her daughter. Then you will be exactly the kind of agent this world so desperately needs, Mara. In that moment, with the air filled with the sweet-scented aroma of baked goods and the warmth of a mother's love, the pain of the experience receded. It was no longer just an unpleasant episode. It became an important life lesson, a stepping stone toward a future where justice and change had a place. But the story didn't end with just their reconciliation. The events at Willow Creek sparked something more. A community awakened. One man's mistake became a point of growth for everyone. Police officers received additional training, Bjork's new programs for teens emerged. And neighbors began to talk to each other more often, not just about the weather, but about the important things, about trust, understanding, and how to avoid similar situations in the future. This story is about the power of compassion, like responsibility, and how one choice can change not only someone's fate, but an entire community. If you have been touched by this story, please share it with others. Perhaps it will inspire someone else to make good changes and strengthen their faith in justice.